I've actually been waiting for this game to come out for a really long time, and I'm sure it's for the same reasons as a lot of other people. I just really wanted to play a game like Shadow of the Colossus on PC, and I wanted to play something like a modern version of that game, but then Pray for the Gods was in development for so long that a Shadow of the Colossus remake came out a year before it went up as an early access title in 2019. The remake turned out to be really good, but I still wanted to play this game because of how ambitious it looked. Anyway, I'll try not to compare both games too much throughout the video, since this is about Pray for the Gods. So the story of this game takes place in a world where a never-ending winter is consuming everything. The prologue talks about how many have tried to fix things by seeking answers in a sacred island that used to contain divine powers. But just like any great legend, it's kind of a one-way trip, so nobody has ever returned from their venture. And this is where the game begins, with the camera panning towards its shipwrecked protagonist. Nothing else is told about the story beyond notes and environmental storytelling. All the game wants you to know is that she's just like the others that came before her. Her goal in the island is to slay all of the gods, in hopes of putting an end to the winter. Normally, I would talk about other stuff in the game first, but since giant bosses are the biggest highlight of this title, I'll be starting with that. The game nails practically every boss encounter. Like, if you're familiar with the Colossi fights in Shadow of the Colossus, then you'll feel right at home with Pray for the Gods. None of your weapons will work on the bosses, so the only way to defeat them is to climb them and interact with their weak points. The general way to climb each boss is to grab onto their fur, but it's not always that simple. Each fight is almost like a puzzle that needs to be solved, since gods can range from humanoids to four-legged giants and even a flying bird-like type. You'll need to figure out how to climb each one by using your tools and the environment. You'll also need to manage your stamina, since it gradually depletes each time you climb. But once you find their weak point, which looks like a circular thing, you'll just need to interact with it and then push the cylinder in. This process needs to be repeated 3 times for each point until the boss is finally down. The boss fights themselves are thrilling. Nearly all of them feel like a cinematic experience, complete with epic music. Though I gotta admit that the fights felt more awkward than cool sometimes. Like, the game has the jankiness of Shadow of the Colossus controls. The main character's movements are sluggish, so it was painful whenever I got knocked down by one of the bosses. Climbing around would get glitchy too, so I would end up falling or clipping onto other body parts. The bosses also do this really predictable thing whenever you interact with their weak point. They basically try to shake you off each time you successfully push the cylinder down. Some of the bosses' shaking animations last a bit too long, so it ends up becoming more of a button-mashing patience test than an endurance one. But when you finally defeat a boss, a cutscene plays, showing its final moments before it turns into stone. You'll always spawn in the same area after watching that happen, which is in the island's temple. A painting inside will show how many gods remain, and then a light up in the sky will show the location of the next boss. The path to each god isn't straightforward though, since the game features an open world with mountains, caves, and quite a bit of loot. The landscape might look a bit intimidating to explore, but the grapple hook and the glider helps a lot, and you can climb on almost every surface too, so nothing really feels impossible to scale, unless you run out of stamina. I didn't explore much of the island though, but I did explore a few caves, and collected every note that I found. It's just, beyond that, nothing really caught my attention. There were some cool looking statues and remnants that made me curious about what happened to the island, but I didn't really discover any interesting loot that made me want to explore more. I was just way more interested in fighting the bosses. But depending on the difficulty level you go with, the journey to each boss might not be easy. The game lets you choose between multiple difficulty levels at the start. It affects things like weapons breaking down, or whether you need to worry about hunger, sleep, and staying warm. I played on normal difficulty with the boost option selected, which I think was the most balanced experience. But yeah, the survival mechanics add to the challenge. You'll need to make sure that your character gets to rest and eat every now and then for buffs. Weather changes pose a problem too. In my playthrough, blizzards depleted my cold resistance, resulting in my character losing health. But I never actually died from a blizzard. I thought they were mostly a nuisance because I couldn't use my glider properly, and it made it kinda hard to see things. But in higher difficulty levels, weather conditions like this become deadlier, so your character is more likely to freeze to death. And just like other survival games, crafting is one of the mechanics of Praey for the Gods. Materials can be found by breaking boxes, cutting trees, and defeating enemies. Apart from making arrows for my bow, I didn't feel the need to craft much, at least compared to other games that focused on survival. I mostly just gathered materials to upgrade my equipment. Materials are also used to repair tools, but I only did that when it was necessary. I didn't want to waste them because tools break really fast in this game. I ended up just hoarding multiple weapons and breaking them down once their durability was low. I avoided a lot of optional enemies for that very reason. Yeah, enemies spawn in some areas of the island. They're not very fun to fight though, especially since the combat in this game isn't great. There were like a handful of attack animations, and just attacking in general felt slow and heavy. The enemies dropped loot that were useful sometimes, but other than that, they felt more like obstacles while I was exploring. I ended up just running past most of them unless I needed materials. There was one enemy that I stumbled upon that was kind of fun to fight. It was one of the champions of the game, which is basically a mini-boss. It was bigger than the common enemies, but it can't be killed with normal weapons. I had to keep hitting it until it got staggered, exposing the weak point on its back. It wasn't too difficult to fight, but I still thought it was cool. Plus, the reward for beating it was so worth it. A grapple hook with high durability. Even with all the flaws and jankiness, I had fun with Praey for the Gods. The story didn't interest me that much, but the game scratched that giant boss battle itch that I've been waiting for. I think the only time I got really frustrated when I was playing was when I encountered the difficulty spike towards the end. Most of the bosses weren't too much trouble, but the last two took me so long to beat. Some of it was by design for sure, but I think I made it harder for myself too. I didn't go out of my way to upgrade more of my stamina by finding totems, so I kept falling off the bosses. I think my playtime went from 6 to 8 hours just trying to finish the game because of that. But yeah, despite all the flaws, I recommend Praey for the Gods, only if you know what you're getting into. This is especially true if you're used to playing more polished titles. But for a game that only 3 people worked on, I think it was really impressive. The scale of both the world and the boss fights made it seem like it was made by a much bigger team. If you want to try it out yourself, Praey for the Gods is out on like every platform except the Switch. Let me know what you thought about the video. Once again, thank you to my patrons at Patreon for supporting my channel. Finishing this game made me want to revisit the Shadow of the Colossus remake. I can't promise that I'll make a video though, at least for now. My video backlog is way too big. There's so much new stuff to play and so much more to revisit. Hopefully I get to release most of them someday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.